June 22, 1944. 3 years to the day after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union strikes back. Along a 450-mile front stretching from the Baltic to the Pripyat marshes, 2.3 million Red Army soldiers prepare to attack. The target, German Army Group Center, defending Belorussia with 800,000 men in positions Hitler has declared must be held at all costs. At dawn, the sky erupts with the thunder of 32,000 Soviet artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower yet assembled on the Eastern Front. The bombardment is apocalyptic, pulverizing German positions that have held for nearly 3 years. Then come the tanks, 200 Soviet armored vehicles advancing in coordinated waves. Overhead, 5,300 Soviet aircraft dominate the skies, the Luftwaffe already defeated by attrition and fuel shortages. What unfolds over the next 8 weeks will be the greatest military disaster in German history, far exceeding Stalingrad in scale and strategic consequence. Operation Bagration, named after a Russian general who fought Napoleon, will destroy Army Group Center completely. 28 German divisions will be annihilated. Over 350,000 German soldiers will be killed or captured. The Soviet advance will cover 350 miles, liberating Belorussia and reaching the gates of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. This offensive, launched simultaneously with D-Day in Normandy, represents the Red Army's supreme operational achievement, a perfectly coordinated multi-front assault that demonstrated how thoroughly Soviet commanders had mastered modern warfare. The German army, once seemingly invincible, will be shattered beyond recovery. After Bagration, Germany's defeat becomes not just inevitable but imminent. This is the story of how the Soviet Union won the war in the East. By June 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had turned decisively against Germany. The Red Army, having turned the tide at Stalingrad, smashed German armor at Kursk, and steadily pushed westward, now stood on Soviet territory's western borders. German forces, ground down by 3 years of attrition warfare, had lost their offensive capability. The Wehrmacht fought defensive battles, trading space for time, hoping to inflict such casualties that Stalin might negotiate peace. Hitler's strategic vision had calcified into delusion. He insisted on holding every foot of ground, refusing to allow tactical withdrawals that might preserve forces for future operations. The Fester Platz, fortified place, concept designated certain cities as fortresses that must be held regardless of encirclement. This policy would prove catastrophic during Bagration, dooming entire armies to destruction when mobility might have saved them. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, occupied a massive salient bulging eastward into Soviet-held territory. This Belarusian balcony stretched from Vitebsk in the north to Bobruisk in the south, with Minsk at its center. The position was strategically vulnerable. A salient invites envelopment from both flanks. German generals recognized this, but Hitler forbade withdrawal. Army Group Center would hold its positions. The German force defending this salient comprised approximately 800,000 men organized into 38 divisions, including several designated as fortified places. The 3rd Panzer Army held the northern sector around Vitebsk. The 4th Army defended the center around Orsha and Mogilov. The 9th Army held the southern sector near Bobruisk. Behind them, Minsk served as the communications and supply hub. If the Soviets could encircle these armies, they would cut off hundreds of thousands of German troops. German intelligence catastrophically underestimated Soviet preparations. The Germans expected the summer offensive to target Ukraine, where terrain favored armored operations, and where advances would threaten economically vital regions. They transferred most panzer reserves south, leaving Army Group Center with minimal mobile reserves. This miscalculation would prove fatal. The Soviet plan was breathtaking in scope and deception. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable commander, coordinated 4 Soviet fronts' army groups. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration would attack toward Vitebsk from the north. The Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky would strike toward Vitebsk and Orsha from the east. The Second Belarusian Front under General Georgy Zakharov would attack toward Mogilev. The First Belarusian Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky would drive toward Bobruisk from the south. These converging attacks would encircle German forces in multiple pockets, then drive westward to Minsk, completing the destruction of Army Group Center. Soviet operational security was unprecedented. The Red Army conducted an elaborate maskirovka deception campaign, creating false concentrations of forces in Ukraine while secretly massing 2.3 million troops in Belarusia. Troop movements occurred at night. Radio silence was maintained. Dummy positions and false signals convinced German intelligence the attack would come elsewhere. The Germans detected nothing unusual until too late. At 400 hours on June 22, 1944, Soviet reconnaissance units crossed German lines to capture prisoners and identify defensive positions. At 500 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire. For 2 hours, 32,000 guns pounded German positions along the entire front. The bombardment was methodical and devastating. Soviet fire coordination had improved dramatically since 1941. Artillery suppressed German batteries, destroyed command posts, shattered communications, and demoralized defenders before the infantry even advanced. At 700 hours, Soviet infantry attacked, supported by tanks and close air support. The Germans fought stubbornly but were overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized deep operations followed by rapid exploitation deep into enemy rear areas. Tank armies would penetrate weak points, then race forward to encircle enemy forces before they could withdraw. In the north, the First Baltic Front and Third Belarusian Front converged on Vitebsk, held by the German IX Corps under General Friedrich Gallwitzer. Vitebsk had been designated a fortified place. Hitler ordered it held at all costs. The Soviet pincers closed rapidly. By June 25, Vitebsk was completely encircled. Gallwitzer requested permission to break out. Hitler initially refused. Finally, he allowed one division to attempt escape while the others held. The breakout attempt failed. Of 35,000 German troops in Vitebsk, only about 8,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. In the center, Soviet forces attacked toward Orsha and Mogilev, key communication centers on the highway to Minsk. The German Fourth Army, spread thin across a wide front, couldn't hold everywhere simultaneously. Soviet breakthroughs created gaps that tanks exploited. German strongpoints, bypassed by Soviet mobile forces, found themselves isolated and surrounded. Hitler's no-retreat policy meant these isolated garrisons couldn't withdraw to new defensive lines. They had to fight where they stood until overrun or starved into surrender. In the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front attacked Bobruisk, defended by elements of the Ninth Army. The assault was methodically prepared and overwhelming. Soviet artillery and airstrikes systematically destroyed German defenses. Infantry and tanks advanced in coordinated waves. By June 27, Bobruisk was encircled. Approximately 70,000 German troops were trapped. Breakout attempts were slaughtered by Soviet artillery and aircraft. By June 29, organized resistance ended. The Ninth Army had been shattered. Within 1 week, Army Group Center had lost 3 of its major strongpoints and suffered catastrophic casualties. But the Soviet offensive was just beginning. The encirclements at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk were tactical victories. The strategic objective was Minsk, and beyond it, the destruction of Army Group Center as a fighting force. With German forward defenses shattered, Soviet tank armies raced westward. The operational concept was classic deep battle. Mobile forces would bypass German strongpoints, drive deep into the rear, and cut off retreat routes. German units, already battered by the initial assaults, found themselves outflanked and encircled before they could establish new defensive lines. Two Soviet tank armies, the 5th Guards Tank Army and 2nd Guards Tank Army, led the advance toward Minsk. They moved with remarkable speed, covering over 100 miles in less than a week. German attempts to establish defensive lines collapsed as Soviet forces appeared where German commanders thought they had hours or days before they'd arrive. The pace of the Soviet advance was unprecedented. This was blitzkrieg performed by the Red Army against its creators. German forces attempted to withdraw westward, but found their escape routes already cut by Soviet tanks. The roads to Minsk became killing grounds as retreating German columns ran into Soviet ambushes. Luftwaffe transport aircraft attempted to supply encircled forces and evacuate wounded, but Soviet air superiority made such missions suicidal. German air losses were catastrophic. Field Marshal Busch, commanding Army Group Center, recognized the disaster unfolding but couldn't respond effectively. Hitler's orders prohibited retreat. German divisions, already shattered by the initial attacks, couldn't form cohesive defensive lines. Communications had broken down. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. Busch didn't know where many of his divisions were or even if they still existed. On June 28, Hitler finally authorized limited withdrawals, but it was too late. Soviet forces were already behind German lines. Withdrawal routes were cut. Entire divisions found themselves trapped in shrinking pockets, surrounded by overwhelming Soviet forces. The orderly retreat Hitler belatedly authorized became a chaotic rout. On July 3, 1944, Soviet forces entered Minsk from multiple directions. The city, held by German rear area units and remnants of retreating divisions, fell after brief fighting. The capture of Minsk completed the encirclement of what remained of Army Group Center. East of Minsk, approximately 105,000 German troops were trapped in a giant pocket. They had no heavy equipment, minimal ammunition, limited food, and no prospect of relief. The Fourth Army had effectively ceased to exist. The Minsk pocket became a scene of desperate fighting. German soldiers attempted to break through Soviet lines in small groups. Some succeeded, perhaps 20,000 eventually reached German lines, but the vast majority were killed or captured. Soviet forces systematically reduced the pocket. Artillery pounded German positions. Aircraft strafed any movement. Infantry and tanks attacked from all sides. By July 11, organized resistance ended. Over 85,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. While Soviet forces destroyed the Minsk pocket, other Soviet armies methodically reduced smaller encirclements across eastern Belorussia. At Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, German garrisons designated as fortified places found themselves besieged, surrounded by Soviet forces that showed no inclination to assault when artillery and starvation would do the job. The German soldiers in these pockets faced impossible situations. Hitler forbade surrender. Breaking out meant crossing miles of Soviet-controlled territory without heavy weapons, adequate supplies, or air support. Staying meant slow death from Soviet bombardment or starvation. Many chose to break out in small groups, attempting to infiltrate through Soviet lines at night. Success rates were low. Soviet forces had become adept at mopping up scattered enemy groups. The destruction of these pockets eliminated German divisions wholesale from the order of battle. Entire corps ceased to exist. Regiments that had fought since 1941, bearing proud designations and battle honors, were annihilated. The human cost was staggering: tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands marching into captivity from which many would never return. German attempts to counterattack and relieve the encirclements failed miserably. The 5th Panzer Division, one of the few mobile reserves available, attacked toward the Minsk pocket. Soviet forces destroyed it before it advanced 20 miles. Other relief attempts never even got started. Soviet forces had advanced so far that the trapped pockets were hundreds of miles behind Soviet lines. Relief was impossible. By mid-July, The destruction of Army Group Center's eastern formations was complete. The Soviet advance hadn't stopped at Minsk, it continued westward at breakneck speed. Soviet commanders recognized that German forces were in complete disarray. This was the moment to exploit success, to drive westward before the Germans could establish new defensive lines. The Red Army's momentum was unstoppable. The second phase of Operation Bagration saw Soviet forces advance 250 miles westward from Minsk, liberating what remained of Belorussia and entering Poland and the Baltic states. This phase demonstrated that Bagration was more than an encirclement battle. It was a strategic offensive designed to shatter German defensive capabilities across the entire Eastern Front. In the north, the First Baltic Front drove toward the Baltic coast, threatening to cut off German Army Group North in the Baltic states. The advance reached Riga's approaches, nearly severing land communications between Army Group North and the rest of the German Eastern Front. Hitler, characteristically, refused to authorize withdrawal, ensuring that Army Group North would remain trapped in the Kurland Peninsula for the war's duration. In the center, Soviet forces advanced on multiple axes toward the Polish border. The Third Belarusian Front drove toward Vilnius and into Lithuania. The Second Belarusian Front advanced toward Grodno and Bialystok. These advances liberated remaining parts of Belorussia and entered territories that had been part of pre-war Poland. The pace of advance averaged 15-20 miles per day, extraordinary speed for sustained offensive operations. In the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front advanced toward Brest and the approaches to Warsaw. Soviet forces reached the Vistula River east of Warsaw by late July, liberating major portions of eastern Poland. This advance would have enormous political and military consequences. It positioned Soviet forces for the Warsaw Uprising tragedy and the eventual advance into Germany itself. German resistance, though increasingly desperate, couldn't halt the Soviet advance. German units rushed from other sectors arrived piecemeal and were defeated in detail. The Wehrmacht attempted to establish defensive lines along rivers, the Berezina, the Niemen, but Soviet forces crossed these obstacles so rapidly that defenses never solidified. German forces were fighting while retreating, never able to establish stable fronts. The scale of German losses was unprecedented. Divisions that escaped the initial encirclements were ground down by continuous combat. Reinforcements arrived and were immediately consumed. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, vehicles abandoned during retreat or destroyed by Soviet forces. The German army on the Eastern Front was bleeding to death. Hitler finally recognized the catastrophe and replaced Field Marshal Busch with Field Marshal Walter Model on June 28. Model, known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to restore desperate situations, attempted to stabilize the situation. He couldn't stop the Soviet advance but managed to slow it, establishing fragile defensive lines that prevented complete collapse. Model scraped together reserves from other sectors, organized retreating units into ad hoc battle groups, and conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved some forces. By mid-August, the Soviet offensive's momentum finally slowed. Supply lines had stretched over 350 miles from the start line to the forward positions. Soviet divisions at full strength in June were depleted by casualties and exhaustion. German defenses, though thin, had stiffened with arrival of reinforcements from other sectors. Soviet commanders called operational pauses to resupply, reorganize, and prepare for subsequent operations. Operation Bagration's casualties reflect its unprecedented scale. German losses were catastrophic and precisely documented through both German and Soviet records. Army Group Center lost approximately 350,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, the largest single German defeat of World War II. Of these, roughly 170,000 were killed or missing, and 180,000 were captured. 28 German divisions were completely destroyed. 17 more suffered losses exceeding 50%. To contextualize these figures, Stalingrad, considered Germany's greatest disaster until Bagration, cost approximately 300,000 German casualties. Operation Bagration exceeded Stalingrad in absolute losses and was far worse in strategic terms. Stalingrad was the Sixth Army, one army. Bagration destroyed an entire army group comprising 3 armies. The difference was existential. Soviet casualties, while heavy, were sustainable given the Red Army's size and the operation's success. Soviet forces suffered approximately 180,000 killed and 590,000 wounded, about 770,000 total casualties. This casualty rate, roughly 2:1 Soviet to German, represented a dramatic improvement from earlier war years when Soviet casualty ratios were often 5:1 or worse. The Red Army had learned to fight effectively, combining firepower, mobility, and operational skill to achieve victories at acceptable costs. Equipment losses were equally catastrophic for Germany. Army Group Center lost virtually all its heavy equipment, over 2,000 artillery pieces, 900 tanks and assault guns, tens of thousands of vehicles. These losses couldn't be replaced. German war production, though still substantial in 1944, couldn't keep pace with losses on multiple fronts. Every tank lost in Belorussia was a tank that couldn't defend against the Western Allies in France or against subsequent Soviet offensives. The operational losses extended beyond mere numbers. Entire staffs, specialized units, trained officers, experienced NCOs, all captured or killed. The institutional knowledge of years of combat was destroyed. German divisions rebuilt after Bagration were shadows of their former selves, hastily assembled formations with green troops, obsolete equipment, and inexperienced leadership. Operation Bagration's strategic consequences reshaped the entire war. Most immediately, it destroyed Germany's ability to defend on the Eastern Front. Before Bagration, the Germans had conducted effective defensive operations, trading space for time, inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet forces. After Bagration, German defenses were improvised, fragile, and easily penetrated. The Red Army would advance steadily westward until reaching Berlin. The offensive liberated Belorussia, one of the Soviet Union's most devastated regions. German occupation had been particularly brutal here: partisan warfare, anti-Jewish massacres, scorched earth policies. Liberation meant Soviet authorities could reassert control, though the reality of Stalinist governance meant liberation was complicated for many Belarusians. Still, German occupation's horrors meant most inhabitants welcomed the Red Army. Bagration's timing, simultaneous with D-Day, enforced a true two-front war on Germany. Hitler could no longer concentrate forces on one front. Resources, reserves, and attention were divided. When Bagration shattered Army Group Center, German reserves that might have reinforced Normandy instead attempted futilely to shore up the Eastern Front. The coordination between Allied operations, though not perfectly synchronized, strategically complemented each other. The advance to Poland's borders positioned Soviet forces for subsequent operations. The Vistula-Oder offensive, January 1945, would launch from positions gained during Bagration. The Baltic offensive isolated Army Group North. The advance into East Prussia put Soviet forces on German soil for the first time. Bagration was the operational foundation for the Red Army's final campaigns. Politically, Bagration demonstrated Soviet military supremacy to the world. Stalin, negotiating post-war arrangements with Churchill and Roosevelt, did so from a position of overwhelming military strength. The Red Army's evident capability to destroy German armies influenced Western Allied decisions about post-war Europe. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe became reality during Bagration's advance. Positions taken in summer 1944 determined post-war political boundaries. Operation Bagration represents the Red Army's operational mastery. The planning was meticulous. Deception operations convinced Germans the attack would occur elsewhere. The concentration of forces, 3 million troops, 32,000 guns, 5,200 tanks, was achieved in secrecy. The coordination between four fronts attacking simultaneously was unprecedented in military history. The execution demonstrated how thoroughly Soviet commanders had learned modern warfare. The initial breakthroughs were methodically prepared with overwhelming firepower. The exploitation phase saw tank armies racing through German rear areas with remarkable speed and coordination. The encirclement battles were textbook examples of operational art, using mobility to trap enemy forces, then systematically destroying them. Soviet logistical capabilities, often underestimated, proved adequate to sustain a 350-mile advance over 8 weeks. Supply columns followed advancing armies, keeping troops fed, armed, and fueled. Engineer units rapidly repaired infrastructure, bridges rebuilt, roads maintained, railways restored. Medical services evacuated hundreds of thousands of wounded. The Red Army had become a thoroughly modern, professional military force. The contrast with 1941 was stark. 3 years earlier, German blitzkrieg had destroyed Soviet armies with ease. Soviet tactics were clumsy, coordination poor, leadership inadequate. By 1944, roles had reversed. Soviet forces conducted mobile operations with German-like efficiency, while the Wehrmacht fought rigidly defensive battles hampered by Hitler's interference. The student had surpassed the teacher. German failure in Operation Bagration stemmed from multiple factors. Hitler's rigid defensive doctrine, forbidding tactical withdrawals, turned potential retreats into encirclements. The fortified place concept immobilized forces that might have escaped. Every major encirclement, Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Minsk, resulted from Hitler's orders to stand fast. German intelligence failures were catastrophic. Completely deceived by Soviet maskirovka, German commanders expected the offensive in Ukraine. Reserve panzer divisions were positioned south, leaving Army Group Center with minimal mobile reserves. When the attack came in Belorussia, no operational reserves existed to counterattack or seal breakthroughs. German operational doctrine had calcified. The flexible, mobile operations that characterized Wehrmacht's success in 1930-919 had disappeared. By 1944, German armies fought static defenses, unable to maneuver effectively. The contrast with Soviet operational fluidity was striking. The Red Army conducted mobile warfare while the Wehrmacht held fixed positions. Logistics and resource constraints limited German responses. Fuel shortages restricted movement. Ammunition was rationed. Luftwaffe support was minimal. Fuel shortages, losses, and overwhelming Soviet air superiority meant German aircraft rarely appeared. German troops fought outnumbered, outgunned, and without air cover. Most fundamentally, Germany was losing the war on all fronts simultaneously. Even perfect defense in Belorussia couldn't change strategic reality. The two-front war was unwinnable. Resources were insufficient. Manpower reserves were exhausted. Germany's defeat was inevitable. Bagration simply accelerated it. Operation Bagration stands as the Red Army's greatest operational achievement and one of military history's most decisive campaigns. In 8 weeks, Soviet forces destroyed Army Group Center, liberated Belorussia, advanced 350 miles, and positioned themselves for the final advance into Germany. The operation combined operational brilliance with overwhelming material superiority to achieve results that fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. For the Soviet Union, Bagration validated the terrible sacrifices of 1941-19 for 3 years of catastrophic losses, millions dead, cities destroyed. All had been endured to reach this moment when the Red Army could conduct operations rivaling the Wehrmacht's earlier triumphs. Soviet commanders demonstrated they had mastered modern warfare. Soviet soldiers proved they could defeat Germany's armies in mobile operations, not just defensive battles. For Germany, Bagration represented catastrophe beyond recovery. The destruction of Army Group Center eliminated any possibility of stabilizing the Eastern Front. The losses, 350,000 men, hundreds of thousands of equipment pieces, couldn't be replaced. From Bagration onward, Germany fought a losing defensive war, retreating westward until the final collapse in Berlin. For World War II's outcome, Bagration was decisive. Combined with D-Day, it created the true two-front war Germany couldn't win. It positioned Soviet forces for the final offensives that would take them to Berlin. It demonstrated Soviet military power to the world and established the foundation for Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. We remember Operation Bagration not because it was humanity's finest hour. The Eastern Front was horror beyond imagination for all involved. We remember it because it represented a turning point, the moment when victory over Nazi Germany became not just possible but certain. The Red Army that had nearly been destroyed in 1941 had become the force that would storm Berlin in 1945. That transformation, achieved through unimaginable sacrifice and suffering, decided World War II's outcome. Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center. More than that, it destroyed German hopes for anything but defeat. The road to Berlin, opened by Bagration in June 1944, would be traveled by Soviet forces during the next 11 months, ending in the ruins of Hitler's capital. The greatest Soviet victory led inexorably to the final Soviet triumph.